In December 1941, Hitler made a decision that seemed minor at the time but would eventually cost Germany the war. He fired the commander-in-chief of the German army and took direct personal control of military operations. His generals had advised retreat from Moscow to save the Wehrmacht from encirclement and winter catastrophe. Hitler refused, issued stand-fast orders, and blamed his commanders for defeatism. The immediate result looked like success: German lines held through the winter. But the long-term consequence was that Germany's most flexible military advantage, its professional officer corps trained in independent operational thinking, was replaced by a single leader who trusted his instincts over military expertise. This was not battlefield tactics. This was a structural change in how Germany made military decisions, and it destroyed the Wehrmacht's ability to respond to changing circumstances on every front for the rest of the war. The German General Staff system had been developed over a century to solve a specific problem: how to fight wars when your enemies outnumbered you. The solution was operational flexibility. Junior officers were trained to understand their commander's intent, and then Hitler had never attended military academy. He had served as a corporal in World War I, experiencing only small unit operations in trench warfare. His understanding of military operations came from personal experience at the lowest tactical level and from studying historical campaigns. He had genuine interest in military history and technical details of weapons. But he lacked systematic training in operational art or strategic planning. More critically, he distrusted the professional military establishment as a class. He saw them as conservative, cautious, and lacking the revolutionary vision that National Socialism represented. When his generals advised, the campaigns from 1939 to 1941 seemed to prove Hitler right. When his generals advised against invading Poland without full mobilization, Hitler ordered the attack and won quickly. When the General Staff presented cautious plans for France, Hitler approved a riskier operational concept that led to spectacular victory. When professionals warned that invading the Soviet Union required finishing Britain first, Hitler launched Barbarossa anyway and achieved massive initial success. Each victory reinforced Hitler's belief that his instincts were superior to professional military advice. The generals who had counseled caution looked like timid bureaucrats. Hitler's boldness appeared vindicated. What was not visible yet was that these victories were won by the professional military system executing operations despite Hitler's interference, not because of it. The operational flexibility and professional competence of German commanders had turned risky strategic decisions into tactical victories. Hitler drew the wrong lesson. He concluded that boldness overcame professional caution, when actually professional execution had salvaged bold gambles. When the Red Army launched its counteroffensive outside Moscow in December 1941, the Wehrmacht faced its first major crisis. German forces were overextended, undersupplied, and unprepared for winter warfare. The professional military response was clear: conduct strategic withdrawal to defensible positions, preserve combat power, and prepare counterattacks in spring. Field commanders began ordering tactical withdrawals. Army group commanders requested permission for operational retreats. The General Staff prepared plans for strategic repositioning. Hitler refused everything. He issued explicit orders that every German soldier would hold his position regardless of circumstances. When commanders continued requesting permission to withdraw in winter 1941-42, Hitler responded with mass firings. Field Marshal von Brauchitsch, the army commander-in-chief, was dismissed and Hitler took direct personal command of the army.
Field Marshal von Rundstedt was removed for ordering retreats without permission.
General Guderian was fired for withdrawing his panzer forces to save them from encirclement.
Dozens of corps and division commanders were relieved.
The message was unmistakable: professional military judgment would be subordinated to Hitler's personal decisions. The new command structure was explicit.
Hitler would make all major operational decisions personally. Army group and army commanders would implement his orders without operational discretion.
The General Staff would become an administrative body executing Hitler's will rather than developing operational concepts. This was not reform. It was the destruction of the institutional system that had made German military operations effective. The purge sent a clear signal to all remaining commanders: disagree with Hitler and lose your command. Under Hitler's direct command, German military operations changed fundamentally. Decisions that professional military systems delegated to field commanders now required Hitler's personal approval.
Tactical withdrawals needed authorization from Supreme Headquarters. Redeployment of divisions required Hitler's consent.
Even minor operational adjustments had to be cleared through the chain of command to Hitler himself. The new system created impossible delays. By the time requests reached Hitler, were considered, and decisions transmitted back, battlefield situations had changed.
Field commanders found themselves implementing orders that addressed yesterday's crisis while today's emergency remained unaddressed.
The professional military culture of mission-type orders, giving subordinates objectives and letting them determine methods, was replaced by detailed instructions from someone hundreds of miles from the front who was working with outdated information.
German operational tempo slowed. Flexibility disappeared. The Wehrmacht's greatest strength was deliberately eliminated by its supreme commander. Stalingrad demonstrated the new command system's catastrophic consequences.
When the Soviet counteroffensive encircled the Sixth Army in November 1942, professional military response was immediate and clear: break out while the encirclement was weak, preserve the Army's combat power, and establish new defensive lines.
Field commanders requested permission to retreat. Army Group Headquarters recommended breakout.
The General Staff calculated that staying in the pocket was strategically senseless.
Hitler refused. He ordered the Sixth Army to hold Stalingrad and promised resupply by air. Luftwaffe logistics officers reported that air supply was mathematically impossible.
Hitler dismissed their calculations. When Field Marshal von Manstein arrived to command relief operations, he found his operational choices constrained by Hitler's direct orders. The Sixth Army was not permitted to break out even when relief forces briefly approached. Operational decisions were made based on Hitler's political imperatives rather than military reality. The result was the destruction of an entire army that could have been saved by decisions any competent field commander would have made if given authority to act. After Stalingrad, the pattern of Hitler's command interference repeated on every front for the rest of the war. At Kursk in 1943, Hitler delayed the offensive while listening to competing advice, then ordered it to proceed despite intelligence showing Soviet preparation. In Italy, German forces were forbidden to conduct elastic defense and instead ordered to hold every position. In France after D-Day, panzer reserves could not be committed without Hitler's personal authorization, and he was asleep when the invasion began.
In the East, field commanders were forbidden to conduct strategic withdrawals even when encirclement was imminent. Each time, professional military judgment recommended operational flexibility. Each time, Hitler's orders demanded rigid defense or offensive operations that circumstances no longer supported.
The Wehrmacht's greatest asset, its professional officer corps trained to think operationally and adapt to changing conditions, was systematically prevented from functioning. German forces continued fighting with tactical skill, but they could not execute coherent operations because operational decision-making had been centralized in one man who was not trained for the role and worked with incomplete information. Some German commanders attempted to preserve operational flexibility despite Hitler's system. Field Marshal von Manstein argued repeatedly for authority to conduct mobile defense in the East. He proposed trading space for time, allowing temporary retreats to preserve forces for counterattacks. Hitler rejected this approach as defeatist. Field Marshal Rommel in France advocated for concentrating panzer reserves where he could commit them immediately when invasion came.
Hitler insisted on personal control of reserve deployments. General Model developed techniques for elastic defense that technically obeyed standfast orders while allowing tactical flexibility. Even these limited attempts at professional military operations were restricted. Officers who pushed too hard were relieved. The message was consistent: Hitler's authority over operational decisions was absolute. By 1944, most field commanders had learned that proposing alternatives to Hitler's directives was career-ending and strategically futile. They implemented impossible orders as best they could and waited for inevitable failure. The July 20, 1944 assassination attempt by German officers was not primarily about military defeat. It was about the command system that Hitler had created. The conspirators included some of Germany's most professional officers who concluded that Germany could not defend itself effectively as long as Hitler personally controlled military operations. Their analysis was coldly professional. German forces were capable of extended defense if allowed to conduct mobile operations, trade space for time, and preserve combat power. But Hitler's rigid command system made effective defense impossible. The conspiracy failed, and the aftermath intensified Hitler's control over military operations. Suspected dissidents were purged from commands. The remaining officer corps had to swear personal loyalty oaths to Hitler. The professional military tradition of serving the state rather than a leader was explicitly destroyed. From July 1944 until the end, no German officer could even suggest operational alternatives without risking accusation of defeatism or treason. The Wehrmacht fought its final campaigns under absolute political control by a leader whose strategic judgment had repeatedly proven catastrophic. By 1945, Hitler's command interference had created operational paralysis across all fronts. In the East, German armies were ordered to hold positions that were obviously untenable, preventing organized withdrawals to defensible lines. In the West, Hitler personally directed the Ardennes offensive using divisions desperately needed for Eastern defense, based on his assessment that one dramatic victory would fracture Allied coalition. When commanders reported that operations were failing and requested permission to adapt, Hitler refused and blamed them for insufficient willpower. The final result was that German forces, still capable of tactical excellence, could not execute coherent operations because operational decisions were made by someone working with incomplete information and ideological assumptions rather than military reality. Units that could have conducted fighting withdrawals were instead encircled and destroyed. Forces that could have been concentrated for counterattacks were dispersed holding worthless territory.
The professional military system that had been Germany's strategic advantage was destroyed by a command structure that centralized all operational decisions in a political leader who substituted ideology for expertise. The human cost of Hitler's command interference cannot be precisely calculated, but it was immense. The Sixth Army at Stalingrad, over 200,000 men, was destroyed because Hitler forbade breakout that professional military judgment recommended. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers were encircled and destroyed in various pockets across the Eastern Front because standfast orders prevented withdrawals to defensible positions. Entire army groups were annihilated in the war's final months fighting for cities that Hitler declared fortress areas, preventing the organized retreat that might have extended resistance and saved lives. German soldiers did not die because they lacked courage or skill. They died because the military decision-making system had been destroyed and replaced with centralized control by someone whose judgment was shaped by ideology rather than professional military training. The tragedy was not that Germany lost, that was inevitable once the two-front war began. The tragedy was that the manner of defeat was made infinitely more costly by a command system that prevented professional military operations. Hitler's interference in military command destroyed more than tactical flexibility. It destroyed the institutional culture that had made German military operations effective. The general staff system that had trained officers to think operationally was replaced with a culture where orders were implemented without question. The professional military tradition of objective analysis was replaced with ideological certainty. The doctrine of mission-type orders was replaced with detailed instructions. Officers learned that professional competence was less valuable than political loyalty. The Wehrmacht's final commanders were chosen not for operational skill but for willingness to implement Hitler's directives without objection. This institutional destruction had consequences beyond immediate military defeat. The German military tradition that had emphasized professional excellence, operational flexibility, and strategic thinking was deliberately gutted. What remained was a force that could execute tactical operations but could not function as a coherent military system because the command structure prevented operational coherence. Military historians studying Hitler's interference in command consistently identify it as one of the war's critical German failures. Germany possessed a professional military system that was institutionally sophisticated and operationally proven. What it lacked was political leadership willing to let that system function. Hitler's decision to personally control military operations was presented as strong leadership taking decisive action. In reality, it was the destruction of Germany's most important strategic asset, the professional military expertise developed over generations. The pattern appears throughout history: political leaders who distrust professional expertise and substitute their own judgment inevitably fail when complexity exceeds what one person can manage. Hitler was not stupid or uninformed. He studied military history and understood technical details. But he lacked the systematic training and institutional perspective that made professional military operations effective. More critically, his ideological certainty prevented him from acknowledging what evidence showed, that professional military judgment was right and his instincts were wrong. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the question was not why German forces lost, but why the manner of defeat was so catastrophic and costly. The answer lay substantially in the command system Hitler had created. Germany's military forces remained tactically capable until the end, but they could not execute coherent operations because operational decisions were made by centralized command that was structurally incapable of processing information and making timely decisions. Professional military systems delegate authority precisely because modern warfare is too complex and fast-moving for centralized control.
Hitler's decision to take direct command seemed like decisive leadership in 1941.
It was actually the destruction of the flexible operational system that was Germany's best chance for extended defense once the strategic situation had turned against it. The Wehrmacht's final campaigns demonstrated what happens when professional military expertise is subordinated to political authority. Tactical excellence becomes operationally meaningless, and forces that should have been capable of organized resistance instead collapse under contradictory orders from leaders working with outdated information and ideological assumptions rather than military reality.